Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about a very peculiar rhetorical technique that we saw in real life practice fairly recently. So as I'm filming this, the United States Senate is debating and amending and what have you the big beautiful bill, which will be absolutely detrimental to the vast majority of people in the United States. It will drive up the national debt. It will increase the police state aspects of the United States, etc., etc. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is actually what happened shortly after the House of Representatives passed their version of the big beautiful bill, which is that a number of Republican representatives who had voted for it almost immediately came out and said, "Oh, I didn't know that X thing was in the bill, or I would not have voted for it." So on the one hand, there's the sort of political dimension of this, which is that Republicans are spineless moral cowards who are unwilling to embrace their own deliberate cruelty and to be honest about the fact that they, as a party, are deliberately cruel. They lack the moral fortitude to say, we are going to hurt the American people, excessively so, and we don't care. But again, that's not really what's interesting about it from a rhetorical perspective. What's interesting from a rhetorical perspective is why this move? Right? Why claim, oh, if I had known that X was in this bill, I would not have voted for it? It seems like a terrible rhetorical move, and it is. You would be right in thinking that this is a terrible rhetorical move. But I want to sort of break down what I think is the thought process behind it and talk about why it is probably not going to do what these Republican representatives hoped that it would do. So, there's widespread opposition to the big beautiful bill. Generally speaking, most Americans, according to virtually all polling, even that done by conservative sites or pollsters, finds that Americans don't really want the stuff that's in it. Most Americans oppose the defunding of Medicare. Most Americans oppose the defunding of SNAP. Most Americans oppose the orders of magnitude expansion of ICE's budget, etc., etc. Most Americans oppose the extension of tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthy while penalizing the poorest Americans. And so the Republicans have an optics problem, or an ethos problem, a credibility problem, which is that while claiming to be on the side of average Americans, to be the party of the working class, etc., etc., they are voting for policies that the vast majority of Americans oppose, and that will be detrimental to the interests of the vast majority of Americans, especially working class and poor Americans who make up their base. So, the question then becomes, how do you get around that? Right? Like, if that's the problem that you are facing, that you want to do a thing that will, in fact, harm your constituents, but you don't want to be voted out of office for it, how do you navigate that? Well, what they seem to have landed on, at least several of them seem to have landed on, is this appeal to ignorance. basically. The thought process is probably something like, well, yes, I've hurt you, my constituents, but I didn't know that I was doing it. Therefore, I'm not morally responsible. And it is worth remembering that when we talk about ethos in rhetoric terms, today we do tend to talk about it in terms of knowledge, credibility, background, education, training, relevant experience, whatever it is. But if we go back to Aristotle in his book, The Rhetoric, he talks about ethos as the moral character of the person. And so what we have here is a kind of ethos appeal in the Aristotelian sense. Oh, I'm not a bad person. I didn't intend to hurt you. I didn't set out to hurt you. I had good intentions. I wanted what was best for the country, and I inadvertently did the exact opposite of that. So that's the underlying thought process. Ignorance of the law is another way is another sort of parallel concept, right? I didn't mean to do something wrong, therefore I am not responsible for the thing that I have done wrong. Now, of course, we know that legally ignorance of the law is no defense, and the question, of course, when we run up to midterms in 2026 will be whether ignorance of the content of the big, beautiful bill is regarded as a defense for voters. But the problem is that with ignorance of the law, one could reasonably plead that in most cases, right? I didn't know that what I was doing was illegal. Sometimes it's obvious, right? If you go out and stab someone to death in the street, and then say, oh, I didn't know that stabbing someone to death in the street was illegal, probably no jury in the world is going to believe you. But if it's like, well, I didn't know that misfiling these taxes in a way that benefited me was against the law, it would be like, okay, sure, that might be true. Tax law is complicated and Byzantine and purposefully obscure. The same situation doesn't really apply here, though. And so the I was ignorant defense may not work in quite the same way. In that, as a representative who has been sent by the people through elections to Washington, D.C., or state legislatures, whatever it is, local government, whatever it is, as someone who has been elected by the people to legislate on our behalf and with our best interests in mind, which is fundamentally what government is supposed to do in the United States. You don't need to put in the comments that that's not really how it works. I'm well aware of that. But that is the ideological interpretation and understanding of what government is supposed to do. That legislators are meant to legislate on our behalf and with our best interests in mind. That means, in effect, that when a legislator votes on something, they have a responsibility. It is literally their job to have read, to understand, and to know what they are voting on. If, as a legislator, you say, I voted on this incredibly consequential bill, this bill that would make massive sweeping changes to the way that the United States functions and the way that, and the options that people have to actually live within our society, and I did not bother to read, I did not bother to understand, I did not bother to know what I was voting on, then that should properly raise questions for voters about whether or not you're fundamentally capable of doing the job at all. If that is central to the job, is to pass legislation that serves our best interests, and you pass legislation that is contrary to our best interests because you could not be bothered to fulfill the basic responsibilities of your position, then it isn't really clear why we as voters should keep you in that position, rather than electing someone else who actually will read, who will understand, and who will know what they are voting on. So it's a strange rhetorical move in that sense. Like, again, the logic of it is, I did not know that what I was doing was bad, and so I should not be held ethically responsible, therefore re-elect me. Now, that's flimsy enough logic on its own. But it steps into the contrary trap of, I have not bothered to do the most basic fundamental elements of the job that I was hired by the people to do, and therefore I'm completely unfit to actually fulfill my role. Therefore, don't re-elect me. It is a strange catch-22 that Republicans have built for themselves, right? If they were to, novel idea that this is, try to pass legislation that would not be detrimental to the vast majority of Americans, that would not be incredibly unpopular, that would not penalize the poor and working classes for the sake of the obscenely wealthy, this problem, this dilemma would not exist. There would be no need to justify one's terrible decisions by pretending that you didn't know that what you were doing was terrible. It simply wouldn't crop up as a problem.